Chapter 1. Harlan's hand is warm against my stomach. That is the first thing I register before I register anything else. His palm, broad and steady, pressed flat against the place where our sun moves in slow underwater rotations at 2 in the morning. I keep my breathing even. Keep my eyes closed. I keep every single muscle in my body perfectly, deliberately still, because 3 years of marriage to triplet alpha kings has taught me one survival skill above all others. Know when to play dead. Earlier tonight, Weston brought me cinnamon tea I didn't ask for because my body has decided, at 7 months pregnant, that cinnamon is the only flavor worth tolerating. He set it on the nightstand with this ridiculous careful precision, like he was defusing something. Then he stood there for a full 10 seconds just watching me drink it with the expression of a man who had personally invented cinnamon and was awaiting my review. I told him it tasted like a candle. He laughed so hard he knocked the nightstand lamp sideways. That was 2 hours ago. Rhodes stole my pillow sometime after midnight. He does this chronically, pathologically, with the shamelessness of a man who owns 6 properties across 3 territories and still cannot locate his own bedding. When I noticed, I pulled it back without opening my eyes. He said, voice rough with half sleep, that I was a menace. I told him I was a pregnant man in his 3rd trimester, and if he touched my pillow again, I would mail it to one of his castles without a return address. There was a pause. Then he put the pillow back. These are my husbands. These are the men I have spent 3 years learning, their habits, their silences, the specific frequency at which each of them laughs. Harlan takes his coffee black and his crises quietly. Weston processes emotion through physical proximity and has never once in 3 years said goodnight without touching my shoulder first. Rhodes communicates through argument the way other people communicate through conversation, and I figured out 18 months ago that when he's picking a fight with me over something small, it means something larger is frightening him. I thought I knew them. Harlan's hand moves slightly, his thumb tracing a slow arc across my stomach, and I think about how many nights I fell asleep exactly like this, convinced I was the luckiest Omega alive. 3 intelligent, complicated, genuinely interesting men who chose me, who wanted me, who looked at Sable Arden, the man whose greatest political achievement was once referring to Parliament as a group project with swords, and decided I was worth a crown. I should have asked why sooner. Their voices are low. They think the distance between the sitting room and the bed is enough. They are wrong. I have the hearing of someone who grew up in a mountain house where sound carries through timber walls like water through paper. Rhodes speaks first. He says the child activates the Calder claim. I stop breathing. Weston asks something I can't fully catch, his voice lower than the others, and Harlan answers in the tone he uses when he is explaining something he has already decided cannot be argued with. His voice barely reaches me, but the words do, clear and quiet and surgical. He says that afterward, I won't be necessary to the succession anymore. The hand on my stomach doesn't move. I don't move either. I am lying in a bed that costs more than my father's entire mountain property, wearing a shirt that belongs to Weston, while the man whose palm is pressed against our unborn son explains my post-childbirth irrelevance to his brothers in the next room. Here is what I do not do. I do not gasp. I do not cry. I do not throw anything, which is genuinely impressive given my current proximity to a lamp. What I do instead is run, very quietly, the entire architecture of the last 3 years through the part of my brain that has always been better at pattern recognition than I've let on. My family owns Red Hollow, 42 acres of Colorado mountain territory that my father always described as worth nothing. No commercial development, no valuable timber, no mineral surveys that ever returned interesting results. Just rock and altitude and a family name attached to a deed that passed through Arden hands for 4 generations. The Calder crown showed interest in me exactly 3 years and 2 months ago. The courtship was sudden. The proposal was faster. I remember thinking it was romantic, the velocity of it. I remember Weston saying he felt like he'd been looking for me. I remember Harlan telling me the first night we spoke that I was unlike anyone in his world. I remember Rhodes being difficult and contrary and provocative in ways I somehow found more interesting than flattery. I remember thinking I must be extraordinary. I was not extraordinary. I was an inheritance mechanism with good sarcasm. Weston says something in the other room. I catch the tone even when I miss the words. apologetic, almost defensive. Then Rhodes' voice comes back, quieter, and Harlan says a name that pulls every remaining warmth out of the room. Mercer, the royal minister. Harlan says that Mercer says everything changes once Red Hollow becomes crown property. I open my eyes in the dark and stare at the ceiling and think about the fact that my son, currently performing what feels like a full gymnastics routine against my ribs, was apparently the plan before he was even a possibility. Then I think about the Red Hollow deed. The original copy. The one I brought with me when we married because my father said never to let paper that important out of your direct possession. I kept it in a locked drawer in the bedroom suite because Harlan said it would be safer there than in the palace archives. I ease carefully out of bed. I cross to the drawer. I press my thumb to the lock. The drawer slides open. It is empty. Chapter 2. I stand at the empty drawer for exactly 4 seconds. Then I close it, walk back to the bed, sit down on the edge, and breathe through my nose the way the midwife taught me for when stress starts pulling at my ribs. In through the nose. Count of 4. Out slow. My son shifts. A heel, maybe an elbow, pressing outward against my side as if asking what the problem is. I put my hand over the movement and think very fast. The deed is gone. Someone with access to a biometric lock that was programmed to my thumbprint has removed a legal document from my private bedroom. The only people in this palace with the technical access to override that lock are the 3 men currently discussing my post-delivery irrelevance in the next room and the palace systems administrator who reports to the royal minister. Mercer. I am not going to cry. I want to be very clear about that. Not because I don't feel it, but because crying takes time and I don't have any. What I feel right now is the specific, clarifying sensation of understanding something I should have questioned years earlier, and that feeling doesn't produce tears. Produces a list. Medical documents. Identification. The encrypted drive my father gave me 3 months before he died. The one I've carried through 2 residences because I never got around to understanding what was on it. Emergency funds. I keep a separate account in my family name that the Calder Financial Office never asked about because they were too confident I had no financial sophistication. The Arden succession paperwork. The secondary copies my father's lawyer sent after the funeral that I filed in my personal records because no one told me to give them away. I move quietly. Pregnancy has taught me stealth the way nothing else could. When your bladder operates on a schedule set by a 7-pound person with no concept of appropriate timing, you get very good at moving through the dark without waking anyone. I take nothing with a Calder crest on it. Not the jewelry. Not the accounts established under my married title. I leave Harlan's credit card on the dresser. I leave Weston's secondary phone he gave me last winter when mine broke. I leave 3 years of accumulated gifts and comforts and beautiful things that apparently had a purpose I wasn't informed of. I do take the ring Rhodes put on my finger the day we married. Not because I intend to keep it, because it belonged to his grandmother and despite everything, I know what it meant to him when he gave it to me. I wrap it in a handkerchief and leave it on Harlan's desk as I pass through the office. Then I take the emergency mountain route from the palace's lower east wing. I know this route because 18 months ago, during a Crown safety review, I pointed out that the original evacuation maps missed a secondary exit running beneath the royal kitchens through the service tunnels to the lower grounds. They updated the maps based on my notes. I am currently very grateful for my own thoroughness. The cold outside is immediate and personal. Colorado in late January does not ease you in. It simply arrives. I pull my coat tighter, one arm across my stomach by reflex, and make it to the vehicle access road before anyone in the palace registers that the Royal Omega has left the building. My car makes it 40 minutes down the mountain before the headlights appear behind me. They're moving fast. Too fast for a standard check-in. I watch the mirror and count 3 vehicles, no royal markings, which is strange because Harlan Security always uses marked transport. I think about that for exactly the amount of time it takes for the first vehicle to pull alongside me and the passenger window to roll down. The guard inside doesn't show a royal badge. He shows a white authorization card with a ministerial seal. Not the king's. Mercer. The triplets don't know I've left. That thought reorganizes everything. Because if Harlan knew I was gone, the first call would have come to my phone within minutes, and it would have been Harlan's voice, controlled and careful, saying my name the way he does when he's frightened and hiding it. The second call would have been Weston, less controlled, more honest about the fear. The third would have been Rhodes, who would have skipped the emotional preamble and asked me directly where I was. My phone rings. Weston. I don't answer. But I listen to the voicemail while I use the mountain's terrain, which I know better than these drivers do, to put distance between me and the ministerial convoy. Weston's voice comes through the speaker, and I hate how immediately it lands in my chest. He says my name. He says if I've left because I heard them, don't trust Mercer. His voice cracks on the last word in a way that Weston, who is the most emotionally transparent of the three, cannot control. I don't turn around. The storm hits 20 minutes later. Real mountain snow, the kind that closes roads and resets everything to white. The convoy loses me in a switchback I take blind on memory alone. My car dies half a mile later, battery or something Mercer's people did to the vehicle remotely. I'll figure that out later. I sit in the dark with the snow coming down, one hand on my son's persistent elbow, and I think about the fact that I am 7 months pregnant, 40 miles from any Arden family property, and holding a flare gun I found in the emergency kit under the passenger seat. Then I get out of the car. I walk. The territorial marker appears through the snow like a warning carved into the world itself. Old iron, weathered past legibility except for the name still visible at the top. Crow territory. A figure steps out of the dark ahead of me. Enormous. Still. Alpha certain in the way of men who have never needed to announce themselves. I raise the flare gun. Chapter 3. He looks at the flare gun. Then he looks at me. Then, with the slow, deliberate quality of a man who has been in actual combat and finds this particular threat rating somewhere below moderate, his eyes drop to my stomach. He says that won't kill him. I redirect the aim past his left shoulder toward the fuel shed 15 feet behind him. 3 tanks, industrial size, visible even through the snow because he hasn't bothered to conceal them. A flare hits compressed fuel and the resulting fire doesn't need to kill him. It needs to be expensive and time-consuming and sufficient motivation for cooperation. I tell him I'm not trying to kill him. I tell him I'm trying to make refusal inconvenient. The silence runs for about 4 seconds. Then something happens in his face that I'm not prepared for. It isn't a smile exactly. It's the small, controlled expression of a man encountering something he didn't anticipate and finding he isn't displeased about it. He tells me to come inside before the storm decides the argument for both of us. My name is Sable Arden. I am 27 years old. I am 7 months pregnant. I am standing in a blizzard pointing a stolen flare gun at Brennan Crow, and my body, my absolute traitor of a body, registers his scent on the wind before I can stop it. Cedar. Cold air. Something underneath both of those things that is warm in a way that makes no sense given the temperature and the circumstances and the fact that this man was exiled from the Calder Crown for treason. I resent the information immediately. I file it under problems to address later and keep the flare gun steady. I know who he is. Former commander of the Crown's primary military force. Dismissed. Exiled. Politically radioactive. The triplets reference him in conversation the way people reference a weather event that caused significant damage, not frequently, but with the specific gravity reserved for things that actually mattered. He knows who I am too. I see it the moment I say my name to justify the sanctuary statute I'm about to invoke. Something shifts behind his eyes, fast and internal, and he says the name Arden with a recognition that is several layers deeper than it should be. That frightens me more than the blizzard. Inside, his outpost is exactly what I would have expected from a former military commander living in deliberate isolation. Functional. Clean. Nothing decorative. A wood stove in the corner producing serious heat. Maps on the table, the kind you mark by hand. A kitchen that contains actual food rather than the ornamental arrangements palace kitchens favor. He doesn't offer me anything immediately, which I appreciate because men who immediately offer comfort to an Omega they've just met are usually either performing or calculating. He just puts another log in the stove and stands back. He points to a door. He says it's the bedroom, the lock works from inside, and the guard position is outside the exterior door, not inside. I tell him I want to know the price. He says nothing. I tell him that's not how alphas work. He says maybe I've been meeting the wrong alphas. The line lands quiet and factual, with no performance behind it. I want to dismiss it. Instead, it sits in my chest like a splinter I can't locate precisely enough to remove. 3 Calder vehicles arrive at the outpost perimeter 20 minutes later, carrying a ministerial authorization demanding my return to the palace for the protection of the royal pregnancy. I hear them through the wall. I hear Brennan's voice, low and unhurried, explaining that he will need to see the king's direct signature before complying with any directive regarding a crown consort. They don't have it, because the triplets didn't send them. I do not stay behind the door. I put my coat back on, walk out into the main room, and address the senior envoy directly while Brennan stands to my left saying nothing. I cite the Interstate Sanctuary Statute, subsection 4, which prevents the forced transport of a pregnant Omega experiencing medical distress across territorial lines without explicit consent from the carrying parent. I am experiencing medical distress. It is called being 7 months pregnant in a blizzard after my husband's minister tried to run me off a mountain road. The envoy looks at Brennan. Brennan looks back at him with an expression that communicates, without words, that the envoy should make a decision very carefully. They leave. When the door closes, Brennan turns and looks at me with the expression I will later come to understand is the closest he gets to open surprise. Not at the outcome, at the method. He says nothing. I sit down because my ankles are making their complaints known and I have made my point and I am tired. Brennan moves to the kitchen. He doesn't ask what I need. He comes back with water, plain crackers, and a blanket that he sets on the table near me rather than placing it over my shoulders, which would have required touching me without permission. I notice that. I notice it specifically. Then I ask him again why the name Arden made him react. He looks at me across the table for a long moment. The wood stove pops. Snow hits the window. He says my father died trying to expose what was buried beneath Red Hollow. The authorization on those envoy papers had Mercer's seal. Not Harlan's. Not Weston's. Not Rhodes. Mercer's. Chapter 4. I don't believe him immediately. That's important to understand. Brennan Crow is a politically exiled alpha with documented opposition to the Calder crown, which means he has structural incentive to tell me exactly what I just heard. So I sit across from him at his hand-marked table with my crackers and my water, and I look at him with the expression my father called my cross-examination face. I ask him to prove it. He gets up without argument and comes back with a locked case that he opens with a physical key. Old school, deliberate, the kind of security you use when you don't trust electronic systems to remain uncompromised. Inside are files. Physical documents. Not copies. Originals with dates and classification stamps and the kind of bureaucratic specificity you cannot manufacture convincingly. 15 years ago, the Calder Crown maintained a covert detention facility. Not a military installation. Not a classified research site. A detention complex, underground, accessed through the lower cavity of a specific geological formation in Red Hollow's western ridge. Unregistered Omegas. Pack members without documentation. People who had been classified as political inconveniences under an emergency registration protocol that was authorized by the Crown and administered by one Silas Mercer, then Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs. The facility ran for 4 years before operational costs and political exposure risk prompted a shutdown. The physical structure was sealed. The records were classified. The detained individuals were either quietly released with non-disclosure agreements they had no real power to refuse, or they simply don't appear in subsequent documentation. My father found it. Not all of it. Enough of it. He found the geological survey anomalies that didn't match the territory's public record, cross-referenced them with a set of transfer ledgers he obtained through an administrative contact, and began building a case. He reached out to the one former Crown official he'd identified as having both knowledge of the program and demonstrated objection to it. He reached out to Brennan. I put the file down. I look at the man across the table and understand why he reacted to my surname the way someone reacts to a name they've been carrying for a long time. I tell him my father has been dead for 2 years. He says he knows. I ask him how. He says he was there. Not physically, he was already in exile when my father died. But he received the news and he knew immediately what it meant. My father's death was classified as a hiking accident on his own property. The specific trail where he was found is not a trail anyone familiar with Red Hollow's terrain uses recreationally, because the grade is wrong and the exposure is too high for casual use. My father was a meticulous, experienced mountain walker who had spent 40 years on that terrain. He didn't slip. I put my hands flat on the table and breathe. My son, with extraordinary timing, delivers a firm kick to the interior of my ribcage. Some days his timing is comedic. Today, it is the only thing keeping me anchored to the present instead of the moment I'm currently reconstructing in my head. My father's funeral, the official report, Harlan's hand on my shoulder telling me he was sorry. Meanwhile, several hundred miles away in a palace I was born with no right to enter and chose to leave before sunrise, the Calder triplets have apparently also been receiving information tonight. Brennan tells me this carefully, watching my face while he does it. The triplets had no knowledge of the detention program. They were told Red Hollow contained a strategically critical mineral reserve. Energy independence, geopolitical leverage, something that justified the annexation that could only be achieved through Arden blood. Mercer managed the intelligence. He managed the documentation. He managed the rationale. He gave 3 young Alpha Kings who inherited a crown with enough operational complexity that they trusted their senior minister to brief them accurately. They were deceived about what Red Hollow contains. They were not deceived about what they were doing to me. That distinction matters. I turn it over slowly and look at it from every angle because I am a person who requires precision when it comes to culpability. The triplets didn't know about the detention program. They still chose to select me from a catalog of Arden heirs. They still engineered a courtship. They still proposed knowing the marriage was structured around access to my bloodline. They still let me fall in love with them for 3 years without once saying the word Red Hollow in any sentence that also contained the word inheritance. Their ignorance of Mercer's deeper agenda does not give me back the 3 years. I open the file Brennan slides across the table. Transfer ledgers, the ones my father had partially recovered. At the bottom of one page, in the annotation column, I see a notation in handwriting I would recognize anywhere. My father's handwriting. His initials. A date. And beside it, a shorthand notation I need a moment to parse because my father used a system he developed for his own records. Parse it. The facility was scheduled to change operational classification upon the birth of an heir carrying both Arden and Calder bloodlines. The child wasn't just a succession mechanism. The child was a legal reclassification trigger. When my son is born, if he carries both names in his legal registration, Red Hollow's underground structure reclassifies automatically under Crown property law as a sealed historical site. Its records become royal classified materials, permanently inaccessible without Crown authorization. Mercer has been protecting this for 15 years. Brennan reaches across the table and turns the next page. There is a surveillance image. Grainy, time-stamped 15 years back. A man entering the facility's access point on Red Hollow's western ridge. I know that face. It is not Mercer. It is the previous Calder King, the triplets' father. Chapter 5. I close the file. I set it on the table with both hands, squared, precise, the way you set something down when you are working very hard on not throwing it. The previous Calder King. Dead 8 years. The man Harlan speaks of with the kind of reverence that never quite sounds like love, respect, obligation, the weight of legacy. The man Weston once told me set the emotional temperature for every room he entered. The man Rhodes has mentioned exactly twice in 3 years. Both times with a flatness in his voice I read as grief and am currently reconsidering as something more complicated. Their father knew about the facility. Not as an inherited administrative problem. Not as a classified briefing he received from a subordinate. He walked through the access point himself. I asked Brennan what he knew about the previous king's involvement when he was commander. He says he suspected. He didn't have confirmation until after his exile. The exile was the answer to his questions. When he started asking them, he stopped being useful to the institution and started being dangerous to it. I look at him for a moment. At this man sitting across a hand-marked table in a mountain outpost, who has spent years in exile for refusing to destroy evidence of what was done to people who had no power, while the institution that did it kept operating and promoting itself and marrying pregnant omegas to ensure its secrets stayed buried. I tell him my father trusted him. He says he knows. He says he is sorry he couldn't do more while it mattered. There is no performance in that. No strategic positioning. He says it the way people say things that have been sitting inside them for a long time without anywhere to go. I look away first. The next morning, Brennan is already at the table when I come out. There is no cinnamon anything on the table. There is a plate of plain eggs cooked with salt and nothing else, and a sleeve of crackers that is the specific brand my mother used to buy because the sodium content is higher than average. I sit down and look at the plate and look at him. He says he found the crackers in his emergency supply. I say that's extremely convenient. He says he restocked last month. I tell him the eggs are fine. He looks mildly vindicated, which on his face looks like nothing at all except a very slight relaxation around the jaw. We work across the same table for 4 hours. He has maps. I have my father's encrypted drive, which I've cracked using a password I found in a letter my father left in my childhood room 3 weeks before he died. A letter I thought was sentimental until approximately this moment. The drive contains documentation that predates Brennan's files by 2 years. My father had been building this case longer than I knew. Brennan stops reading at one point and says that when I'm nervous I make jokes. I tell him I'm always making jokes. He says there's a difference. When I'm actually nervous, the jokes get mean. I open my mouth. Close it. He's right. That is an annoying amount of observational accuracy from a man I have known for less than 48 hours. I tell him the eggs were aggressively salty. He says that's not a joke, that's just accurate. Something loosens in my chest slightly. Not much. Enough to be uncomfortable about. He slides something across the table. An envelope. My name on the front in handwriting I recognize immediately, and the recognition physically stops me. My father's handwriting. I look up. Brennan tells me he was given this by my father to deliver under a specific condition. Not if something happened to my father. Not as a safety protocol. The instruction was specific. He was to give this letter to me only if I independently chose to investigate Red Hollow on my own. If I arrived at the truth through my own decision and not because someone forced me to it. My father did not want to drag me in. He also refused to lie to me, so he created a condition. A test that wasn't a test. If I chose this, he would give me everything. I chose the road that brought me here. I chose to leave before sunrise. I chose to cross into Crow territory rather than turn back. My father knew me well enough to design a condition I would eventually meet. I open the letter. I read it alone while Brennan gets up and does something in the kitchen that is not hovering, which I appreciate. My father writes the way he talked, direct, economical, only the essential words. He explains what he found. He explains what it means. He explains why he didn't tell me while he was alive. The last line says, "You are the only Arden thing I did right, Sable. Do it better than I did." I fold the letter. I hold it with both hands in my lap for a moment. My son is still, for once, as if he understands. Then I open the primary document file and turn to the page Brennan has already found for me. A marriage acquisition proposal. Formal Calder stationery. Detailed specifications for identifying a suitable Arden heir of appropriate presentation, with a legal analysis attached confirming the bloodline inheritance clause. 3 signatures at the bottom. Harlan, Weston, Rhodes. The date on the document predates my first conversation with Weston at the Crown's spring reception by 9 weeks. I look at Weston's signature specifically, at the date beside it. Then I run the timeline backward to something he said during our courtship. Something I held on to because it felt real, felt spontaneous, felt like the kind of truth people only say when they're not being careful. He told me he thought he was falling for me. He said it 6 weeks before this document is dated. Which means when Weston told me he was falling for me, he had already signed the paper authorizing the arrangement. Chapter 6. Weston's signature sits on that page dated 9 weeks before he ever looked at me across a reception hall and said my name like he'd been searching for it. I closed the file. The triplets arrive at Red Hollow's outer gate at noon. No army. No royal transport convoy. 3 men in civilian vehicles on a mountain road in January, which tells me everything about the state they're in, because Harlan Calder has not traveled without security in 8 years. Brennan tells me they're there. He tells me without editorializing, without recommending a course of action, without placing himself between me and the decision. He just says they're at the gate and asks what I want to do. I tell him to let them in. They look terrible. That's the first thing I notice, and I refuse to feel guilty about noticing it. Harlan's jaw is set in the way it gets when he has been awake for more than 30 hours and is holding his own exhaustion in place through architectural control. Weston's eyes find me immediately and stay there with an expression I have never seen on his face before. Not guilt exactly, something rawer than guilt. Rhodes walks in last and looks around the room, at the files on the table, at Brennan standing near the window, and then at me, and he doesn't try to hide what's on his face at all. That's always been Rhodes' one honesty. He can't mask a thing when it matters. I let them stand. Harlan speaks first. He says he knows why I left. He says that whatever I heard, whatever conclusions I drew, he needs me to understand that what began as strategy did not remain that way. I tell him I need him to be more specific about what began as strategy. He is. That's what breaks it open. Harlan, who speaks in diplomatic architecture, who chooses every word for structural soundness, lays it out without cushioning. The acquisition proposal, the selection criteria, the legal analysis attached to my bloodline. He says he believed securing Red Hollow protected the Western territories. He says he told himself the feelings that developed afterward made the beginning irrelevant. I tell him that's the most expensive lie a person can tell themselves. Weston doesn't wait for an invitation. He says he fell first. Genuinely, actually, in a way he hadn't prepared for and couldn't reverse. He says he considered telling me. He was terrified I'd walk away before he could make it real. So he said nothing and let me fall in love with a version of our beginning that was engineered before I existed in his life as a person. I look at him and say it slowly so every word lands separately. He was so afraid of losing me that he made certain the man he loved never actually had him honestly. Weston doesn't answer. There's nothing to answer with. Rhodes, across the room, speaks without being asked. He says he knew the arrangement wasn't right. He signed anyway. His brothers needed him unified, and he chose their crown over my right to choose anything at all. Every single one of them failed me differently. That is somehow worse than one clean betrayal. Then Harlan tells me they never issued the recall order. Mercer forged the royal authorization. Worse, Mercer has mobilized a private contracted force toward Red Hollow with orders to recover the facility access documents before they reach federal jurisdiction. He is 30 minutes out. Near the window, Brennan has said nothing during this entire exchange. But I catch him. Just once. He watches Weston with the expression of a man calculating something he doesn't have complete information for, and I understand it immediately. He is watching three men who know which side I sleep on and why my sarcasm peaks when I'm frightened, and he is feeling the specific, unglamorous discomfort of that. He doesn't move toward me, doesn't claim space, doesn't make a single gesture that asserts anything. That is what does it. That restraint, that absolute refusal to use the moment. I find him outside after the triplets begin coordinating the defense response with his team. We stand close. The cold is immediate. His scent finds me before I make a decision about it. I nearly close the distance. I stop. I tell him I can't make him the man I run to because I'm running from them. He says then don't. No pressure behind it. No wound. Just clarity. My attraction to him shifts into something heavier and less manageable than attraction. And then every light in the outpost dies simultaneously. Communications drop. Gunfire opens from the eastern ridge. Chapter 7. The first shot takes out the generator shed, and the second confirms Mercer's people aren't warning us. I am already at the table before the echo dies, pulling the territorial map flat with both hands. Brennan is beside me in 3 steps. The triplets come through the interior door with Harlan's hand already on his radio and Rhodes pulling a secondary weapon from his jacket with the practiced efficiency of a man who came prepared for a fight even while coming to beg forgiveness. I tell them to stop. All of them. Every alpha in this room, stop. They stop. I put my finger on the map at the northern access road. Then I put it on the service trail that branches east at the ridge marker. Then I trace the route Mercer's contracted force is using to push toward the facility entrance on the western side. I know this route because 18 months ago Harlan asked me to review the Calder emergency mapping system for gaps. I spent 2 weeks on it. I submitted 15 pages of notes. One of those notes flagged the Western Ridge approach as a critical vulnerability in any defensive scenario. Mercer's people are using my notes. I tell them the northern approach is the diversion. The actual push is coming through the eastern service trail toward the facility entrance. If they hold the ridge line with 2/3 of available personnel and collapse the eastern trail with a rockfall trigger at marker 7, the contracted force loses its primary access route and has to regroup on open ground where they're visible and slow. Brennan looks at the map, then at me. He tells his team to execute it exactly as I described. No debate, no modification, no alpha instinct overriding field logic because the intelligence came from a pregnant Omega who technically has no military rank. Harlan watches this and something moves across his face that he keeps to himself. I organize the civilian evacuation through a snow tunnel on the property's southern edge. 3 families, 2 staff members, 1 very elderly neighbor who arrived at the outpost 3 days ago for reasons that were never fully explained and who takes the tunnel situation with remarkable calm. I move them through personally, then come back. Mercer's contracted people have orders. I know this because one of them is captured alive, which was my specific instruction to Brennan's team, and the orders are written on an actual card in the man's jacket. The Calder Crown produces written field orders because Harlan's father believed oral instructions created deniability problems. Old institutional habit. The card says, Arden Omega recover alive. Documentation destroy, not kill. Recover. My son is still the mechanism. While I breathe and move and think and refuse to be a passive object in anyone else's plan, Mercer still needs him born safely. The legal transfer cannot occur without live birth. Everything Mercer has done, the marriage arrangement, my father's death, the forged recall order, this attack, all of it requires me to survive long enough to deliver. I am the most dangerous person on this mountain because I know exactly what I'm worth to him alive. Brennan takes a hit on the ridge. Not severe. A graze shoulder, enough to bleed through fabric in a dark stain I clock from 30 yards away and feel in my sternum before I fully process seeing it. I move toward him. He is already redirecting 2 of his people with his uninjured arm, voice unchanged, not performing toughness, actually functional because he has decided the mission outcome matters more than the pain. I reach him and put my hand on his face. He stills. I tell him I need him thinking, not bleeding through bad decisions. He looks at me. For 1 full second he just looks at me, and whatever he finds in my face makes him exhale and redirect his attention back to the field with the kind of sharpness that had apparently been slightly blunted by concern for me. Trust lands physically between us in that moment. Not romantic. Real. The kind that functions under pressure. From a recovered field tablet, Brennan pulls intercepted communications from Mercer's command position. The messages are time-stamped and specific. They reference the detention program by its original classification code. They reference my father by name. They reference an authorization code for the original facility construction. And then Mercer's voice comes through the open channel, directed not at his field team but at me specifically, because he has apparently decided negotiation is worth attempting. He says the records cannot become public. He says I know what happens to Calder legitimacy if they do. He says he can give me everything. Money, freedom, protection, a life away from the crown with my son intact. Then he says the part that removes every remaining variable from my decision. He says once the records are sealed as royal classified property, the remaining unaccounted detainees from the program can be quietly processed without public interference. There are still people inside Red Hollow. There are still people inside Red Hollow. Chapter 8. 15 years. 15 years and there are people still being held in a facility that was supposed to be sealed and decommissioned, in the mountain territory my father died trying to expose, under the land my son's birth was meant to bury permanently. I look at Brennan. He already knew. I see it the moment I look at him. Not guilt. Something worse. The grief of a man who found out something unconscionable and lost his entire institutional standing trying to stop it, and still did not stop it in time. I ask him how many. He says 11 confirmed. Possibly more depending on records Mercer controlled. I turn around and walk back inside. The triplets see my face and Weston starts to speak. I tell him not yet. I sit down at the table and I breathe through 4 counts and I think about 11 people in an underground facility on my family's land while I spent 3 years attending crown functions and selecting curtain colors for a palace suite I never owned. Then I stand up and I tell everyone in the room exactly what we are doing. Brennan's communications team establishes a federal line. I give the duty officer my full legal name, my relationship to Red Hollow's title deed, and a summary of what I have physically in my possession. The officer escalates within 4 minutes. Federal jurisdiction supersedes Crown territorial authority the moment a credible claim of unlawful detention is filed by the property heir. Mercer loses his window. The contracted force on the ridge begins standing down as federal alerts hit their employers' legal departments with the specific velocity of people realizing their contracts just became criminal exposure. Harlan takes the federal line next and does the thing I did not ask him to do and did not expect. He identifies himself. Full title. He states that the Crown is cooperating with the investigation, that all documentation in Calder possession related to Red Hollow will be surrendered without a court order, and that he is personally withdrawing any claim to the territory effective immediately. Rhodes signs the digital withdrawal beside him without a word. Weston looks at me when he signs it. He doesn't say anything either. He just holds my eyes while his signature registers and then looks away. 3 hours later, federal and PAC rescue teams reach the facility entrance. I don't watch. I can't. I sit in the outpost kitchen and hold my own hands and think about my father's last line. Do it better than I did. The people coming out of that tunnel are the answer to why he was on that mountain trail. He knew. He died knowing. He sent me a letter through a man he trusted and hoped I was stubborn enough to follow the road here. Brennan sits down across from me. He doesn't offer comfort. He doesn't perform anything. He just sits the same way he sat when I read my father's letter, present without pressing. I tell him I'm falling in love with him and I hate how much power that gives him. He doesn't react the way I brace for. He doesn't reach for me. He doesn't look triumphant. He looks at me with the even undeflected attention that I've come to understand is just how he processes things that matter. He says don't give him power. Give him honesty. His hand comes up slowly. He cups my face with a steadiness that has nothing possessive in it. His thumb rests against my jaw and he waits. Just waits. I close the distance. The first kiss is slow. Testing. His mouth against mine with a held-breath carefulness, as if getting it right matters more than getting it fast. He starts to pull back and I catch his jacket and bring him back and the second kiss is not careful at all. It is weeks of restraint and cedar scent and 2 people who found each other in a blizzard through the worst circumstances either of them has navigated. And it is honest the way only things earned through difficulty can be. We stop before it becomes something else. Because I am 7 months pregnant in an active federal operation and some timing is just objectively wrong. He rests his forehead against mine. Then his phone activates. His legal team, calling to say the federal prosecutor is offering Brennan a formal immunity agreement in exchange for his full testimony. Clean record. Conviction vacated. Everything restored. The catch is that the agreement requires him to submit the evidence without naming me as a source. To protect me from public exposure during the trial. He mutes the call and tells me both options honestly. His protection or my testimony. I tell him I'm testifying. He nods once like he already knew. Then every major PAC news network simultaneously pushes a breaking story. Edited surveillance footage, clearly manipulated, showing Brennan leading me forcibly into his outpost while I appear distressed. The headline calls him my captor. Chapter 9. The footage is 62 seconds long, and it is constructed with the precision of someone who had professional help. I watch it once on Brennan's tablet. Then I watch it again more slowly, tracking the cut points. There, when I raised the flare gun, that moment is removed entirely. There, when Brennan stepped back and waited for me to enter first. That's cut. What remains is footage of a large alpha in military gear guiding a visibly pregnant Omega through a door in low-light snowstorm conditions. Stripped of every second that would explain what was actually occurring. Mercer didn't release this during the attack. He released it after, once he lost control of the physical operation. This is his second front. If he cannot bury the records through legal mechanisms, he will bury Brennan's credibility and mine by association, and make the testimony of a pregnant Omega who fled to his known enemy look like the confused account of a person being manipulated. The federal hearing is scheduled for Denver. 11 days. In those 11 days, I watch Brennan get called 17 different kinds of predator across every pack media platform while he sits at his table reviewing evidence files with the same expression he had when he cooked eggs. The scrutiny doesn't touch something essential in him. He answers his legal team's questions precisely, sleeps 4 hours a night, and one morning leaves a fresh sleeve of my crackers on the table without mentioning it. I let myself feel what that is instead of cataloging it at a distance. I tell him one night that I don't understand how he does it. The stillness. Under all of this. He says he stopped performing composure years ago. This is just what he actually is. I tell him I grew up performing strength because the alternative was being managed. He says he knows. He says he figured that out the night I walked into his outpost and aimed a flare gun at his fuel supply instead of asking for help. I say asking for help required trusting someone. He says he knows that too. The Denver Tribunal is formal and enormous. Press on every level, federal arbiters, PAC council representatives, and a gallery that has been waiting since the footage dropped for the spectacle of watching either Brennan or me collapse. Neither of us does. Mercer's defense presents the footage as primary evidence of psychological coercion. His legal team argues I am a traumatized royal consort with compromised judgment whose testimony has been shaped by prolonged exposure to a known crown adversary. I present the flare gun receipt from Brennan's emergency supply inventory, time-stamped on the night of my arrival, which confirms the weapon was already in the kit when I took it, meaning I arrived armed and independent, not dependent and controlled. I present the sanctuary statute filing in my own handwriting with my own legal citations, submitted by me to the Calder envoys before Brennan said a single word on my behalf. Then I present my father's files. All of them. The arbiters go quiet in the specific way of rooms where large numbers of people have just understood something they cannot unfind. Harlan testifies next. He stands at the front of a federal tribunal with the full weight of the Calder crown behind him, and he tells the truth. He says the marriage to Sable Arden was initiated for territorial access. He says his father's administration authorized the program. He says the Crown's full documentary record is available without precondition. He does not dress it in strategy. He uses plain language and he does not look at me while he does it, which I understand is because he is afraid that if he looks at me he will not finish. Rhodes testifies that love did not cancel deception. He is the only one of the three who phrases it exactly that way, and it costs him something visible to do it. Weston testifies last. He says he fell in love with me genuinely and was a coward about it in ways that mattered, and that genuine love does not excuse a person from the consequences of how they chose to protect it. I file the marital severance during a recess. All three of them receive it without contesting. That is the thing I will carry longest, not the betrayal at the start. The fact that when I handed them the legal end of everything we were, they all signed it and let me go. Mercer rises for a final statement. He produces a document, a prenatal Calder succession registration. My son's name, filed through the Crown Medical Registry 4 months ago. He says the transfer of Red Hollow has already occurred. He says it happened the moment that registration was processed, under the Dormant Inheritance Clause, and there is nothing a severance filing can do to reverse a succession event that completed before divorce proceedings began. Red Hollow is already gone. My son is already theirs on paper. Brennan, 2 rows back, separated from me per legal protocol, presses 2 fingers to his wrist. I breathe. Chapter 10. I reach into my document folder and I pull out a single page. It is a legal opinion from my father's estate attorney, drafted 14 years ago, obtained by my father after he first discovered what Red Hollow contained. He didn't just investigate the facility. He investigated the inheritance clause itself because my father was meticulous and he knew that if anyone ever tried to use it, the mechanism required examination. The clause has one condition that Mercer's registration ignored. No unborn Arden heir can exercise inheritance rights without the explicit written consent of the living Omega parent, filed after live birth, within 30 days of delivery. Prenatal registration establishes lineage. It does not complete succession. The consent filing is the activation step. Without it, The registration is an administrative record with no legal force. I have never consented. My son has not been born. Mercer's registration is fraudulent because it presents a preliminary step as a completed transaction, and I am standing in a federal tribunal with the attorney's opinion, my father's original research, and 14 years of documentation that proves this clause has never once been executed without the post-birth consent filing in the entire history of Arden succession law. The arbiter asks Mercer's team to respond. They cannot, because it is true. Red Hollow was never transferred. The clause was never completed. The entire legal architecture Mercer built over 15 years required my willing participation in the final step, and I am the one person in this room he could not control. My father spent his life trying to stop this and died before he could. What he did instead was make sure I would have everything I needed when I arrived here. He trusted a man in exile to keep his files. He wrote me a letter I wouldn't receive until I found the courage to choose the road. He built me a legal argument I didn't know I was carrying. He couldn't stop it himself. So he made me the person who could. The tribunal rules within the hour. Mercer is arrested on sight. The charges are extensive: conspiracy, unlawful detention, evidence destruction, authorization of a murder, fraudulent succession filing. He is processed without spectacle. He walks past me on the way out and he doesn't look at me. I think he cannot. The 11 people recovered from Red Hollow's facility are transferred to federal care. The identification process begins. Reparation proceedings are filed the same week. Red Hollow is designated protected autonomous territory under my legal ownership, with a secondary designation as an Omega sanctuary and historical site. The records will be public. The names will be public. The program will have no classified shelter left. Mercer's institutional protection is gone. The truth is no longer a risk to anyone's succession. Brennan's treason conviction is formally vacated 8 weeks later. The documentation confirms he had been exposing an illegal government program, not betraying a legitimate crown function. Everything they took from him, his rank, his record, his standing, is reversed on paper. He doesn't celebrate this. He receives the notification, reads it once, sets it on the table, and makes dinner. I tell him that's an underwhelming response to having his entire life restored. He says his life is fine either way. I ask him when that became true. He thinks about it honestly, the way he does everything, and he says sometime around the night a pregnant man threatened his fuel supply with a flare gun and he realized he had finally met someone whose stubbornness exceeded his own. We have been doing this for months now. Dinner, arguments, long evenings with evidence files replaced by books. One spectacular disagreement about whether he is actually capable of cooking anything that isn't eggs or things adjacent to eggs. He learns I hate being touched when I'm overwhelmed but need it badly when the sadness settles in later, quiet and heavy. I learn he wakes from nightmares about the facility sometimes and lies completely still in the dark afterward because he doesn't know what to do with the feeling. I know what to do with the feeling. I find his hand in the dark and hold it without saying anything. He lets me. That is its own language. Our son is born on a Tuesday, which feels appropriately ordinary for something that rearranges everything. 8 pounds, unreasonably loud. The most ardent face I have ever seen outside a mirror, and completely unbothered by the legal, political, and emotional significance of his existence. Brennan is in the hallway when it happens, which is where I asked him to be. When I tell the nurse he can come in, Brennan stands in the doorway for a moment and looks at the two of us, and the expression on his face is the most unguarded thing I have ever seen on him. My son grabs his finger immediately. Power recognizes power. 3 months after that, Brennan brings plans to my kitchen table. A structure, adjacent property, foundation lines drawn in his own handwriting, careful and detailed in the way of someone who has been thinking about this for a while. He says he wants to build something, not on my land, not inside my house as any kind of authority over it. Beside it, his own ground, his own door, close enough. I study the kitchen on the plans. It is small. I tell him he is going to need a bigger kitchen. He frowns. I tell him because I am saying yes. He is quiet for a moment. Then he reaches across the table and his hand closes over mine, warm and unhurried, and he doesn't say anything at all. He doesn't need to. We have both learned that the most important things don't require more words than are necessary. What I learned from all of it, from 3 kings who loved me after lying to me, from a man in exile who held my father's letter until I was ready, from 11 people in a mountain facility who needed someone stubborn enough to not stop, is that safety was never about who had the most power in the room. Safety is choosing someone powerful who would rather lose you than take from you without asking. That is the only version of protection worth having. The end.